Madness. Drink it in, people. Drink it in. So, I yesterday decided, I don't know if there's a way to measure parity or what might have happened, because we don't know what's going to happen with the 2020 Stanley Cup. So, what is the most likely outcome? Well, things weren't quite as random as they are now, back in the day. All I've got on the board is everything from the 67 expansion era on. So 67, 68 is the first year on the board. And so we've got the teams down here and how they finish up here. And then we've got the 2019-2020 season here, along with a look at likelihoods going all the way back to 68. 68, Montreal finished first overall. The Rangers and Boston were second and third. Montreal finishes first and wins the cup. 68-69, Montreal again finishes first. Boston and the Rangers are second and third, as the Eastern Division is made up of the good teams, and the Western Division was all expansion. This was not well thought out. So Montreal, the number one overall team, they win the Stanley Cup again over the Blues. The Blues, who were the best of a bad division in the West. 69-70, Chicago finishes first. Boston second. Detroit third. Boston, the number two team in the league, wins the Stanley Cup. So that's the first number two on that board. And St. Louis again loses in the final. That's their third straight year. So the NHL, seeing that there's an error, moves Chicago to the West. That ends St. Louis going to the Stanley Cup Finals. Boston finishes first in 70-71. The Rangers second and Chicago third. So technically, it's the first time that a Western team shows up, but it's Chicago. So Chicago had been in the East. Chicago loses the Stanley Cup final to Montreal. Montreal actually finished fourth that year. So that's a team outside the top three winning a Stanley Cup. Now, the following season, 71-72, the Bruins win again. They're number one in the NHL. The Rangers are second. Montreal's third. Boston wins the Stanley Cup against the Rangers as they changed the playoff format. And so two teams in the East met each other in the finals, and Boston wins it. And they're the number one team. Montreal's number one in 72-73. Boston second, the Rangers third. Chicago goes to the Stanley Cup final against Montreal again, and they lose again. So Montreal, the number one team, wins 73-74. Boston's number one. Philadelphia's number two. Chicago number three. Philadelphia, the number two team in the league, beats number one and wins the Stanley Cup. 75. Philadelphia's the number one team in the league. Buffalo's number two. Montreal's number three. That's right, the Buffalo Sabres on the board for 1 out of 2 times for them. And they lose in the Stanley Cup final to the number one team, Flyers. And the Flyers, again, show that the President's Trophy jinx wasn't a thing back then because there was no President's Trophy. 75-76. Montreal does not allow Philadelphia to win their third straight Stanley Cup, but they were the number one team in the league as well. Philadelphia number 2 and Boston number 3. 76-77. Montreal, Philly, and Boston. Again, 1, 2, and 3. Montreal beats Boston in the finals. So again, it's the number one in the NHL and the Stanley Cup winner. 77-78. Again, Montreal's number one in the league. They win the Stanley Cup over Boston. Boston had been number 2 in the regular season. And the Islanders were number 3 that year. 78-79. The Islanders are number 1 overall. Montreal's number 2. Boston's number 3. Montreal wins the Stanley Cup over the Rangers in 78-79. And this is where the conversation of maybe the Islanders aren't going to win a cup starts to come up. Well, 79-80, they proved that's just foolish talk. But they're not in the top 3. The top 3 are comprised of Philadelphia, Buffalo again, and Montreal is number 3. So Buffalo, their top 3 finishes are actually 3 on the board. So let me just make a quick change there. Again, it's a lot to follow. The Islanders were number 5 in the NHL, and they win the Stanley Cup over the Flyers. 80-81, the Islanders are number 1 in the NHL, and they win the Stanley Cup over the Minnesota North Stars. I don't have a North Stars logo that size, so I put Dallas up there. St. Louis and Montreal are number 2 and 3. Mike Liut's number 2. He dragged the St. Louis Blues there in 81. 81-82, the New York Islanders are number 1. The Oilers number 2. And Montreal number 3, and the Islanders beat an upstart Vancouver Canucks in the finals that year. 83-84, the Islanders are second, but the Edmonton Oilers, I should say, are number 1. Boston's number 3, but the Islanders lose in the finals to the Edmonton Oilers. So the Islanders, and this year, I skipped 82-83. Sorry about that. 82-83, the one in between. Boston's number 1. Philadelphia number 2. So Philadelphia on the board a lot. The Oilers number 3. And the number 6 overall Islanders win the Stanley Cup over the Oilers in the Stanley Cup Finals. So there you go. The Oilers were number 3 in the NHL. The Islanders number 6. 84-85, because I talked about 83-84. 84-85, the Oilers win the Stanley Cup. They're number 2 overall in the NHL behind Philadelphia, but they beat them in the Stanley Cup Finals. And the Capitals were number 3 that year. I've talked about that, how the Capitals were pretty darn good, and yet it's easy to forget that. 85-86, the Oilers, number 1 in the NHL. Philadelphia is number 2, and the Capitals are number 3. None of those teams end up in the Stanley Cup Finals. It's between the number 7 Montreal Canadiens and the Calgary Flames, and the number 7 Montreal Canadiens win it. That is the lowest ranked team to win a Stanley Cup to that stage. And it's Patrick Roy's Stanley Cup, let's be honest. 86-87, the Oilers are number 1. Flyers are number 2, and the Flames are number 3. At this point, Flyers fans are like, you're picking on us. Not intentionally. This is just history. I can't change history. I wish I could. There'd be a lot more Canucks up here. Number 1 in the NHL, Oilers do win the Stanley Cup over the Flyers. Don't worry, as a Bruins fan, I feel that pain against the Oilers. 87-88. The Flames are number 1 in the NHL, Montreal's number 2, and the Oilers are number 3. That's 3 Canadian teams in the top 3, and that's a rarity. Now, Montreal and Calgary are out, and the Oilers beat Boston in the finals, the Oilers being the number 3 team. And again, not a low seed, doing pretty well. 88-89, it's again Calgary first. It is the Montreal Canadiens second. It is the Capitals third. And Calgary wins the President's Trophy and the Stanley Cup over the Montreal Canadiens in a battle of 1 versus 2. 89-90, Boston's number 1 in the NHL. Calgary's number 2. And number 3 are the Buffalo Sabres. So the Sabres are up there way more. I'll change that to a 4. Took a long time, so I apologize for mistakes. The Oilers were number 6 overall in the NHL in 89-90. That was, of course, after Gretzky had left. They beat the Boston Bruins in the Stanley Cup Finals, so the number 1 overall team in the regular season. Doesn't matter in the finals. Edmonton made it look relatively easy. 90-91, Chicago finishes first in the NHL. St. Louis is number 2. LA's number 3. It is the only time LA shows up in a top 3 in the NHL, and they don't win it. The cup goes to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who were number 7 in the NHL, so their first number 7 since Montreal Canadiens here, and they beat the upstart Minnesota North Stars, again using the Dallas Stars logo there. 91-92, the New York Rangers are number 1 overall in the NHL, the Capitals are number 2, and the Detroit Red Wings are number 3, and all 3 teams are labeled as chokers at this stage of the game. The cup goes to the number 6 overall Pittsburgh Penguins, who beat the Chicago Blackhawks in a matchup between 2 teams that both recorded 11 wins in a row in those playoffs. Now, the 92-93 Penguins finished first overall. Boston's number 2, Chicago's number 3. None of those teams make it to the finals because all the favorites went out early in those playoffs. Montreal, number 6 overall. They beat the LA Kings in the Stanley Cup Finals, and that is the Kings' first time in a Stanley Cup Final. 93-94, the New York Rangers are number 1 overall, and they win the Stanley Cup. New Jersey's number 2, Pittsburgh's number 3, and of course, Vancouver loses that Stanley Cup Finals against the New York Rangers. 94-95, Detroit is number 1 overall, the Colorado Avalanche number 2, and Pittsburgh number 3. Your Stanley Cup winners, the New Jersey Devils, 9th overall. That is the lowest number we've seen to this stage, and they beat the Detroit Red Wings in the finals. 95-96. Detroit's number 1 again. Colorado's number 2. Philadelphia's number 3. Now, when I say Colorado 94-95, that's the Nordiques. Got to go back and correct. That is the Nordiques. And then they moved to Colorado, where again they finished 2nd overall. Philadelphia's number 3. And in the Stanley Cup Finals, the number 2 overall Colorado Avalanche, now with Patrick Roy, beat the Florida Panthers. It's the only time Florida shows up on the board. That's it. They've never been a top 3 team. Now, 96-97, we have the Colorado Avalanche number 1 overall. Dallas is number 2 and New Jersey's number 3. Detroit wins the Stanley Cup. They were 5th overall, and they beat the Philadelphia Flyers in the finals. 97-98, Dallas is number 1 in the NHL. New Jersey's number 2 and Detroit's number 3. For the Stanley Cup, Detroit at 3rd beats the Washington Capitals in the finals. 98-99, Dallas is number 1 again. Number 2, The New Jersey Devils, number 3, the Ottawa Senators. Your Stanley Cup winners are the President's Trophy winning Dallas Stars over Buffalo in the finals. One of the reasons this video exists and that I'm doing this is because when I was talking about best team that didn't win a Stanley Cup, there were a lot of comments of, you could have just put Detroit all the way from 93 through to 2009. No, there's been parity. I mean, I could, but that would be dishonest. There have been seasons that, Detroit was pretty good, but there have been seasons where their goaltending's had problems, and we'll get to that when I get to the playoff series I picked for 99. So, 99-2000, St. Louis wins the President's Trophy. Detroit's number 2, Philadelphia's number 3, and your Stanley Cup goes to the New Jersey Devils, who finished 4th overall over Dallas in the Stanley Cup Finals. 2000-2001, Colorado, number 1 overall, and Stanley Cup champions. Detroit's number 2, New Jersey's number 3, and New Jersey lost that Stanley Cup Finals. The 2001-2002 season, Detroit finishes 1st overall and wins the Stanley Cup. Boston's number 2, Toronto's number 3. That is the only time Toronto shows up on the board as well. Detroit wins that Stanley Cup against the Carolina Hurricanes in 2002. 2002-2003, Ottawa finishes 1st overall. Dallas is number 2, Detroit's number 3, and your Stanley Cup champions, New Jersey, at 4th. They beat the Anaheim Ducks in the Stanley Cup Finals. 03-04, Detroit finishes 1st overall. Tampa Bay number 2, San Jose number 3. First time San Jose's on the board, won't be the last. And for the Tampa Bay Lightning from the number 2 spot, they end up winning the Stanley Cup over Calgary. So that's all of your playoffs until we get into the salary cap era, where people have said, hey, because of the salary cap, things are a little more even, a little more unpredictable. And they're absolutely right. Check it out, how it goes from here. 05-06, first year with the salary cap. Detroit's number 1. Ottawa's number 2. Dallas is number 3. Your Stanley Cup, the number 4 overall team, Carolina Hurricanes, beat the Edmonton Oilers. 06-07, Buffalo is 1st overall. Detroit number 2. Nashville number 3. Yes, Nashville. And your cup goes to the Anaheim Ducks, who were 4th overall over the Ottawa Senators. 07-08, the Detroit Red Wings are number 1 overall again. San Jose's number 2 and Montreal's number 3. And the Stanley Cup was the number 1 overall Detroit Red Wings, who beat the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, the revenge would belong to Pittsburgh the following year, 08-09. The 8th overall Pittsburgh Penguins end up being your Stanley Cup champions. Interestingly enough, Pittsburgh's only finished 1st overall once in their entire existence, and that was one year they didn't win the Stanley Cup. They've won the Stanley Cup now from 6th, 7th, and from 8th. And they've never won the Stanley Cup from the same position twice. So the fact they were 7th overall at the time of the break means they won't win the Stanley Cup again from 7th, because, anyways, we'll get to that. Now, they win the Stanley Cup over Detroit. Detroit, of course, had been number 3 overall that year. 09-10, Capitals are number 1. San Jose's number 2. It's the 3rd year in a row San Jose's in the top 3. Chicago is number 3, and they win the Stanley Cup from that 3rd spot over the Philadelphia Flyers. 2010-2011, Vancouver is number 1 in the NHL. That's the first time they're in the top 3. One of only 2 times they're in the top 3. It's another reason I wanted to do this video, because I think top 3 gives you a real idea of who the elite in the NHL were. And I think the concept that the Canucks were really, really good for a long time is out there, and I don't think the data backs it up. The Capitals are number 2. The Penguins are number 3 that year. Boston, from the number 7 spot, wins the Stanley Cup over the President's Trophy winning Canucks. The Canucks win the President's Trophy again in 2011-2012 over the New York Rangers and the St. Louis Blues, who finished 3rd. And then 13th overall, LA puts everything on its ear by winning the Stanley Cup over the New Jersey Devils in 2012. So that just turns everything on its ear, and that's why team number 13 is on the board in the 2019-2020 season as well. 2012-2013 lockout shortened season. The Chicago Blackhawks finish 1st overall and win the Stanley Cup. Pittsburgh and Anaheim round out the top 3, and Boston is defeated in the Stanley Cup Finals by Chicago. Boston finishes 1st overall in 2013-2014. Anaheim's number 2, Chicago's number 3. Your Stanley Cup goes to the number 9th overall LA Kings. This is the 2nd time that the 9th rated team in the NHL ends up winning the Stanley Cup, New Jersey having done it in 95. And again, that's against the New York Rangers, who had been number 2 in the NHL a couple years before and actually won the President's Trophy in 14-15, and didn't get very far in the playoffs that year. Montreal's number 2 and the Anaheim Ducks number 3. The Stanley Cup goes to the number 7 overall Chicago Blackhawks over the Tampa Bay Lightning. 2015-2016, the Capitals finish first overall again. They finished first while Dallas is number 2, St. Louis is number 3. Pittsburgh wins the Stanley Cup from 4th overall over the San Jose Sharks in the Stanley Cup Finals. 2016-2017, the Washington Capitals, again, President's Trophy winners. Pittsburgh number 2, Chicago number 3. Pittsburgh, from that number 2 spot, wins the Stanley Cup over the Nashville Predators in the finals. The Predators take that momentum from the finals, that confidence gained, and they win the President's Trophy in 2017-18, and all of the pennants belong to them except that Stanley Cup winner. Winnipeg finishes second overall, first and only time Winnipeg's on the board. Tampa Bay's number 3, and your Stanley Cup goes to the Capitals, who were 7th overall and won it on the road in Vegas. Vegas was actually the home team in that series. 2018-2019, Tampa Bay, first overall, Calgary, number 2, and Boston, number 3. Your Stanley Cup goes to the number 12 overall St. Louis Blues over the Boston Bruins in that final. Keep in mind, St. Louis had been 3rd in 2015-2016, only 3 short years before they win the Stanley Cup. And they've been 3rd in 2011-2012. So there's been some success there. So if you're wondering about your teams and where they finished, three top 3 finishes for the Anaheim Ducks. Didn't win a Stanley Cup in any of those. Their Stanley Cup came when they were 4th. They were a finalist and lost once. The Arizona Coyotes do not appear on this board. The Boston Bruins were top 3 19 times, won 3 Stanley Cups since expansion started, and lost in the finals 7 times. So when Bruins fans talk about, we're clearly the favorites. No, see, that tells me that if Bruins get to the finals, there's a good chance they're going to lose. Buffalo, 4 times on the board with a top 3 finish and finalists twice. Calgary, top 3 finish 5 times. Now I'm looking over the board and going, yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it's 5 times. Yeah. For whatever reason, I had that blind spot with Buffalo. Cups, 1 Stanley Cup for Calgary, of course, and they lose in the finals twice. The Carolina Hurricanes have never been a top 3 team in the NHL, but they got a Stanley Cup final and win when they were 4th, and they made it to the finals on one other occasion. Chicago, 7 top 3 finishes for Chicago, 3 Stanley Cup wins, and 3 trips to the finals, which ended in losses prior to that. The Colorado Avalanche, 4 top 3 finishes, including 1 as the Quebec Nordiques. They win 2 Stanley Cups. They didn't go to the finals on any other occasion. Columbus, not on the board. Dallas, 6 times they were top 3. And that includes the Minnesota North Stars. 1 Stanley Cup, that was 99, and of course 3 times in the finals that they lost, including twice as the Minnesota North Stars. The Detroit Red Wings have been top 3 in the NHL 14 times, which is one of the higher numbers on the board. 4 Stanley Cups, 2 times they went to the finals and lost. The Edmonton Oilers have been top 3 in the NHL 6 times, 5 Stanley Cups, and 1 loss in the Stanley Cup finals. Top 3 finish for the Florida Panthers? No. Stanley Cup? No. 1 finalist. The LA Kings have been top 3 once. They've won 2 Stanley Cups, both times outside the top 8 in the NHL. And they were a finalist and lost in 93. Minnesota's not on the board. Montreal, 15 top 3 finishes, 10 Stanley Cups. They lost in the Stanley Cup finals once. It's a rarity. Nashville, 2 top 3 finishes and 1 Stanley Cup finals. The New Jersey Devils, 5 top 3 finishes, 3 Stanley Cups, and 2 times they were finalists and lost. The Islanders, 4 top 3 finishes, 4 Stanley Cups, and they were a finalist on a 5th occasion. All in a row. The New York Rangers, 9 times have been top 3, 1 Stanley Cup, 3 losses in the Stanley Cup finals. The Ottawa Senators, 3 times in the top 3, and finalists once. Philadelphia, top 3 11 times. Stanley Cups, 2, and final losses 6 times. Again, as a Bruins fan, I feel you. Philadelphia, I do. 2 and 6 in the finals. Boston, 3 and 7. It's really not better. Pittsburgh, 5 Stanley Cups, 1 loss in the finals. 6 times they've been in the top 3. Interestingly enough, only 1 of their 5 Stanley Cup finishes, where they won it, involved actually being a top 3 team in the NHL. So that's one of those things. Pittsburgh seems to do better when they're not necessarily a favorite. It's bizarre, and they've never been number 1 overall and won the Stanley Cup. San Jose, 4 top 3 finishes, 1 final appearance. San Jose, or St. Louis, I should say, 5 top 3 finishes, 1 Stanley Cup, and losing in the Stanley Cup Finals. Those 3 times right there. Tampa Bay, 3 top 3 finishes, 1 Stanley Cup, and 1 finish in the finals, which they lost in 2015. Toronto, the 1 top 3 finish, and that was in 2002. Vancouver's been top 3 twice. That's back-to-back President's Trophy winners. And 3 finals that they lost. Vegas has the 1 Stanley Cup Finals, of course. They've never been top 3 in the NHL. Washington, top 3 8 times. 1 Stanley Cup. They were 7th overall the one time they won it. And they were in the Stanley Cup Finals and lost in 98. They weren't a top 3 team then either. If Washington's a heavy favorite, bet against them in the playoffs, is what I'm saying. And then Winnipeg, 1 top 3 finish. So out of all these numbers, it took me quite a while to put on the board. This board took a while to put together. I'm quite proud of it. Quite proud of it. 2019-2020. If you're looking for an odds-on favorite. First off, in the cap era, this one right here, this row right here shows you good luck. You can roll dice. You can flip coins for an hour to figure out who you think's going to win a Stanley Cup. And you've got a good chance of coming out right. But no team below 13th in the NHL's won it. So that's where Columbus was at the time of the pause, and that's the LA Kings of 2012. 12th place, that's where Toronto lies. The only team that's won that was 12th was last year's St. Louis Blues. So there you go, Toronto, you would have won the Stanley Cup this year. Back-to-back years where 12th overall does it. 11th has never won the Stanley Cup. 10th overall has never won the Stanley Cup. So even in this era, certain numbers that haven't won it yet. 9th overall has won twice. So the LA Kings in 2014 and the New Jersey Devils in 1995. 8th overall, 1 victory for 8th overall. So for Vegas, who were sitting in 8th, for the Oilers who were sitting in 9th, there's some hope. 7th overall is a good spot. 5 teams have won the Stanley Cup from 7th overall, including in the cap era, 3. 3 teams that are 7th overall have won the Stanley Cup since the cap era began. 6th overall, 4 teams have won from 6th overall during the cap era. That's not a thing. The 8th place team was during the cap era, so again for Vegas, right? Philadelphia's 4th overall right now. Philadelphia's 2 Stanley Cups. They won when they were 2nd and 1st. So it's a handy board. I need to take a picture of it before I take it apart. Number 5, there's been one Stanley Cup winner from 5th overall. It's bizarre, isn't it? You would think it would be a lot more. I'm just going to look over the board. And yeah, it was Detroit back in 97. And that's the only number 5 on the board. Number 4 overall, Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay, who were 4th. There's 6 teams. 6 teams that have won from 4th overall. In the cap era, you've got Pittsburgh here, you've got Anaheim, and you've got Carolina. So 3 of them in the cap era. 3rd overall, that's been a good time for 3 teams. So this is where it's strange, right? You've got 6 from 4th overall, 5 from 7th, and only 3 from 3rd. It's really, really weird. And the first one that won it from 3rd overall was the Oilers here. And then we've got Detroit here. So the Oilers in 88, Detroit in 97, or 98 I should say. And then 3rd overall, Chicago in 2010. So it's rare. I don't know why that is. 2nd overall has been good 7 times, which makes sense. I've talked about how, yes, you know, the curse of the President's Trophy. Yeah, but number 2, Pittsburgh in 2017, they were pretty good. Number 2, Tampa Bay in 2004, they were pretty good. Number 2 overall was pretty good for Colorado in 96. And that's it for over the last quite a while. And then 2nd overall was actually more beneficial back in the 70s and late 60s. 1st overall is won at 19 times. But again, you need to mention that in the cap era, being 1st overall has not been a huge benefit. You've got Chicago in 2013. You've got Detroit in 2008. And that's it. So parity is definitely a thing. So for fans in Boston who, believe that this was going to be the year, I understand the optimism. I somewhat shared it. But when you look at it, a top 3 team has won the Stanley Cup. Let's see, once, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So once out of the last 6 years, a top 3 team has won the Stanley Cup. So part of the reason why I would be taking Tampa or Washington right now, neither of them are in the top 3. Top 3 teams just, I don't know if it's that they don't play important games down the stretch. I don't know if it's that they're playing against teams that have had to play harder going into the playoffs or what it is. But being a favorite going into the playoffs very often means not winning in the playoffs. So I'm not, sometimes I see people saying, well, you're not taking this team because you just don't want to sound like everybody else. No, I usually don't take the top rated team because the top rated team very rarely wins. And so I look at where we're trending, and there's more parity than ever in the NHL. You can't look at the teams that have been low rated that have won the Stanley Cup, like the Kings in 2012, and look at that roster and go, well, it was pretty much a trash roster. You can't. That's a really good roster that happened to be 13th overall in the NHL. So parity has definitely made a huge difference. You look back to the 60s and 70s, and it was pretty obvious that the team that finished first overall had an excellent opportunity to finish and win the Stanley Cup. And then things kind of, you can make the argument that the loss of dynasties has hurt the NHL, but it has made it so that any team can kind of win it. So these are the teams that are in spots that currently, right now, as of the pause, could potentially be Stanley Cup champions. Although for Carolina and Dallas, it doesn't look good because no team in 10th or 11th has ever won the Stanley Cup. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And yeah, this is madness. This is what an actual madness video looks like. And I want to say this is the most magnets I've ever had on a board. And I've still got a playoff series video that I've got ready to go, which means more magnets on that. So yeah, this is I'm happy with this. This is good. This is this is what madness does. When Shannon's not watching hockey, this is when no hockey's on, this is what happens. So there you go. Thank you guys so much for all of your attention and your time. If you made it all the way through this, thanks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the retention. Thanks for the numbers and all that other wonderful stuff. And I can do stuff like this again as we go on through this pause, whatever happens from here. But there you go. Thank you guys so much once again. Remember, stay home as much as you can right now until we got this figured out. And there are signs we're getting things together and getting it figured out, and that if we keep this up, then sooner rather than later, we can have this in the rearview mirror. And I'm looking forward to that. Greatly, greatly, greatly looking forward to that. So optimism's good with a dose of being realistic, but still optimism's a good thing. And hey, thank you guys so much for all your help getting through this. And I'm happy to produce content to help people get through all of this as well. Thanks again. I will talk to you guys very soon.